Today we are in week 2 of a 3-week sermon series entitled Family Blueprint. Family Blueprint. Throughout this series, we're talking about getting our priorities into the right order. Unfortunately, we live in a time where more marriages are failing than ever before. This is sad, but statistics are telling us that there's just as much divorce inside the church as there is outside the church. Mental illness is at an all-time high. People are more medicated than ever before. Suicide rates are on the rise. More and more kids are being exposed to drugs, alcohol, sex, pornography. The list goes on. I was definitely no angel child growing up, but I work with teenagers on a weekly basis. And I'm shocked at how much more they're exposed to and how much earlier they're exposed to it than I was just 10 or 15 years ago. I think we can all agree the world is becoming a scary place, but I believe there's a solution. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm naive, but I believe God can and will turn things around if we're willing to get our priorities in the right order. I believe God can and will turn things around if we're willing to humble ourselves to follow His blueprint. If you're taking notes, if you want to write it down, I've entitled this second message, 6 Rules for a Healthy Marriage. 6 rules for a healthy marriage. The Bible makes it clear. This is true for every single one of us. If you are a Christian, your number one priority is your relationship with God. That's what we talked about last week in week 1. The Bible makes it clear if you are married, your spouse is your second priority. That's what we're going to talk about this morning here in week 2. But if you're not married, I don't want you to tune me out. Because this is applicable for dating couples, this is applicable for engaged couples, this is even applicable for single people. These 6 rules can be applied to any type of relationship. So 6 rules for a healthy marriage, but this is applicable for every single person. If you want to follow along on the screens, Mark chapter 10, Jesus says this, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." So a couple things I want to point out before we really jump into this. Jesus says it. He says marriage is between a man and a woman. This is the New Testament. He doesn't say marriage is between a person and a person. He makes it very clear. Marriage is between a man and a woman. They come together. They're a unit. They become one flesh. They make a lifelong commitment in sickness and in health, for better, for worse, through thick, through thin. What God has joined together, let not man separate. And I also want to stop here and address something in love. And I say this from love. I really, really do. But I hear this a lot from couples. We live together, we pay bills together, we do all these things together. We really just don't want to complicate the relationship by getting married. And a lot of times this is because one or both of them have had a bad experience in the past with marriage. And I just want to say marriage is more than a piece of paper. Marriage is more than a business agreement. If marriage is important to God, marriage should be important to us. What does this mean? I think for some of us it means one of two things. We either need to make some adjustments in our relationship to align it with God's Word, or we need to make a commitment in our relationship to align it with God's Word. Now, if there's one area where I feel I fall short over and over and over again, it's marriage. So I feel so unworthy, I feel so unqualified. I don't feel I am unworthy, I am unqualified to preach this message. Please know I'm not preaching at you, I'm being preached at with you. No one needs to hear this more than I do. Today I want to share with you 6 things that God is teaching me. I could easily share 10, 15, probably even 50, but these are the 6 that God has laid on my heart. If you're not taking notes for yourself this morning, take notes for your spouse. 6 rules for a healthy marriage. Here's the first one, number 1. If God's not first, my marriage will suffer. If God's not first, my marriage will suffer. In Matthew chapter 22, some people come to Jesus and they ask Jesus a question. They say, "Hey Jesus, what is the greatest commandment of them all?" This is what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 and 38. And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and the first commandment. So the first, the great, above everything else, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. We talked about this last week, so I won't spend much time here. Not only should God be first in your life, God should be at the very center of everything in your life. If you're the best thing you can do for your marriage is this: put your spouse second. God is your one, your spouse is your two. You say, well, why will my marriage suffer if God's not first? When God's not first, you put unrealistic expectations on your spouse and unrealistic expectations on yourself. Imagine an empty cup. That's what you bring into the relationship when God's not first. And you expect your spouse to fill that empty cup, and you expect to be able to do the same for your spouse. You're expecting your spouse to meet all of your needs. You're expecting your spouse to fill a void within you. You're expecting your spouse to bring you joy, contentment, happiness, satisfaction. The list goes on. And don't get me wrong, marriage is a great thing. There will definitely be seasons of joy and happiness, seasons where you feel like you're in a scene of The Notebook. You can't get enough of each other. But there will also be difficult seasons. Seasons where the wedding ring feels more like a wedding handcuff. Seasons where you really honestly just don't want to be near each other. And when things go bad, we begin to think, well, maybe it's just not meant to be. Maybe we've fallen out of love. Maybe there's someone else out there that I'm more compatible with. No. Your spouse isn't the problem, you're the problem. You're looking for and expecting a person to fill something only God can fill. So that's when you don't put God first. When you do put God first, you don't bring an empty cup into the relationship, you bring an overflowing cup into the relationship. You're not looking to get something out, you're looking to pour something in. I can't be the husband God calls me to be until I put God first and my wife second. It's only out of the overflow that I can love my wife the way that I've been loved. It's only out of the overflow I can forgive my wife the way that I've been forgiven. It's only out of the overflow that I can extend grace like it's been extended to me. The first rule for a healthy marriage: if God's not first, my marriage will suffer. The second rule, number 2, my spouse is my first priority on earth. My spouse is my first priority on earth. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So how did Christ love the church? His first priority after obeying and glorifying the Father was the church. He died for the church. So if I'm going to love my wife like Christ loved the church, my wife has to be my first priority. After obeying and glorifying the Father, she is my number one on earth. Back up just a few verses, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. It says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Here's the point. If you're married, husband or wife, the Bible makes it clear. Your number one priority on earth is your spouse, second only to God. And I'm convinced this is true for men and women. We have a tendency to let other earthly things slip in and take priority over our spouse. A lot of us put our careers before our spouse. A lot of us put our hobbies before our spouse. A lot of us put our children before our spouse. We have a tendency to let other things slip in, and here's our excuse. Well, my spouse will understand. I can say no to my spouse and yes to whatever this is over here. Why? Because my spouse will understand. I've been guilty of this myself many times before. Maybe I'm put between a rock and a hard place. I need to spend some time with my family, specifically with my wife. But then there's something going on at church, or someone calls me last minute, or I feel obligated to do something and I have a choice to make. I can guard my time with my family, or I can let something slip in and take priority. And I've failed many, many times before, but I'm slowly learning to say no to other important things so I can say yes to the most important thing, which is my spouse. The longer I'm in ministry, the more I realize my first ministry as a husband and a father is not my church. My first ministry is my family. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for providing, I'm all for working, I'm all for putting food on the table. I'm always striving to get ahead financially and looking for ways to become a better provider. But I understand and I realize the most valuable thing I can give my family isn't a nice house or fancy cars or private schools or money or success. The most valuable thing I can give my family is very simply my time. And the same is true for you. The most valuable thing you can give your spouse is your time. So learn, as difficult as it may be, to say no to other important things so you can say yes to the most important thing, which is your husband or your wife. The first rule for a healthy marriage: if God's not first, my marriage will suffer. The second rule: my spouse is my first priority on earth. The third rule, number 3: not every action needs a reaction. Not every action needs a reaction. I remember my second day of high school. Second day of 9th grade. I was in a classroom. I stood up. I was holding some papers in my hands like this. Another kid stood up and he slapped the papers out of my hands. Now, I should have picked the papers back up. I should have went about my business. I should have ignored him altogether. But instead, my instincts took over. I pushed him. He punched me. I punched him. We were rolling around on the floor. Next thing I know, I'm sitting in the principal's office with a busted lip, waiting for my dad to pick me up because I was suspended from school. He slapped the papers out of my hand. His action didn't deserve or need a reaction. And if I wouldn't have reacted the way that I did, I could have saved myself from getting into a lot of trouble. I think something similar happens a lot of times in marriage. Not the punching and the pushing part, at least I hope not. But one person in the relationship, either the husband or the wife, they do something or they say something, and then the other person reacts. There's an argument. Men, next thing you know, you're sleeping on the couch. Not every action needs a reaction. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23 puts it this way: whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Here's the bottom line. We all have bad days. We all have things that happen at work. We all get stressed. We all get discouraged. We all get sick. Sometimes we just wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Your spouse will not be happy-go-lucky every single day. There will be days your spouse comes home and they're short with you, not because they're mad at you, but because they've had a terrible day. There will be days your spouse is irritable and on edge. There will be days your spouse says something they don't mean or does something they shouldn't do. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you should let your husband or your wife treat you like a doormat. But what I am saying is that sometimes it's best to love them even when they don't deserve it. Sometimes it's best to extend grace. Sometimes it's best to put yourself in their shoes, to see things from their perspective. Sometimes it's best to hold your tongue. Sometimes it's best to let them know that you're for them and not against them. I don't have anything to back this up with other than personal experience, but I think a couple is about 10 times more likely to get into an argument when one of them is having a bad day. So I think there's two sides to this, two lessons here. If you're the one having the bad day, avoid taking it out on your spouse. It's not their fault. On the flip side of that, if your spouse is the one having the bad day, recognize it, take note. Tread lightly. Again, encourage them. Let them know that you're for them and not against them. Give them space if that's what they need. First rule for a healthy marriage: if God's not first, my marriage will suffer. Second rule: my spouse is my first priority on earth. Third rule: not every action needs a reaction. The fourth rule for a healthy marriage, number 4: a better marriage begins with me. A better marriage begins with me. As a pastor over the years, I've worked with several different couples. And to date, this has never happened. I've never had a couple walk into my office, sit down in my chairs, and then one of them start out like this: Pastor, I'm a terrible husband. I'm a terrible wife. I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing this wrong. My spouse is great. They're perfect. It's all me. I have so many issues. I'm trying to work through these issues. I just want to be the best husband or the best wife that I can possibly be. Would you please help me with that? To date, that has never happened. Here's what usually happens. The couple walks into my office. They sit down. One of them starts out. They might admit some things that they've done wrong, but that's followed by 10 things their spouse has done wrong. Like, he doesn't make me a priority. He works all the time. He won't pick his underwear up off the floor. He didn't even get me a card for Valentine's Day. Or you know what? She spends so much money, I'm working overtime to pay the credit card bill. She never cooks for me. I come home after work to a bowl of Captain Crunch and a messy house. She doesn't support me, and we only have sex on the holidays. In my experience, the focus is almost always on how the other person can improve and what the other person is doing wrong. And I just want to remind couples of something that Jesus said. This is from Matthew chapter 7. He says, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye? Or in the context of marriage, why do you see the speck that is in your spouse's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, how can you say to your spouse, let me take the speck out of your eye when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye, your spouse's eye." Think about this. What if every time you said or thought about something your spouse could do to become a better spouse, you instead thought about something you could do to become a better spouse? I'll even take it this far. I think the best way to change your spouse is to change yourself. If you want her to start cleaning the house, why don't you pick up your clothes and put them in the hamper? If you want her to cook for you, why don't you make the bed? And I know my wife's taking some really good notes right now. If you want him to watch chick flicks with you, why don't you go hunting or fishing with him? You have to make each other a priority. And you have to stop focusing on how the other one can change and start focusing on how you can change. That's how you can have a better marriage instantly. First rule for a healthy marriage: if God's not first, my marriage will suffer. Second rule: my spouse is my first priority on earth. Third rule: not every action needs a reaction. Fourth rule: a better marriage begins with me. The fifth rule, number 5: collaboration is impossible without communication. Collaboration is impossible without communication. Maybe I'm the only husband in the room that has a wife that has imaginary conversations with me. Like, something will come up out of the blue and I'll get frustrated. Babe, I wish you would have told me about that. Well, I did 2 weeks ago. We had a full 30-minute conversation about it. So I don't know if I'm just a terrible listener or if my wife is losing it altogether. But either way, I'm convinced the majority of confrontation in my marriage and the majority of confrontation in your marriage can be solved with proper communication. And that involves 2 things. That involves talking and that involves listening. You're a unit, you're a team, you're one flesh. In order to get on the same page, in order to collaborate, you have to communicate. Romans chapter 14, verse 19 says, "So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbringing." Finances, arguably one of the most, or arguably the number one cause of divorce. You need to communicate about finances. What are your goals? When do you want to retire? What budget do you have in place, regardless of how much money or how little money you make? What do you value? Where do you want to spend? Where do you want to save? What rules do you have in place? For instance, before we spend over X amount of dollars, we're going to sit down and have a conversation about it as a couple. Children, they bring a whole new dynamic to the relationship. How can you be united as parents? What are your priorities? How are you going to discipline? Careers. What are your goals? Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? Church, faith, family, sex, fears, insecurities, aspirations. If you want to thrive as a couple, you have to get on the same page. You have to collaborate. And in order to collaborate, you have to communicate. So put the phones down, turn the TVs off, close the laptops, sit down and talk, have a discussion with one another, and make a habit of doing it. The reason most couples constantly find themselves in the midst of confrontation is because they're not communicating on a regular basis. Rule number 1, if God's not first, my marriage will suffer. Rule number 2, my spouse is my first priority on earth. Rule number 3, not every action needs a reaction. Rule number 4, a better marriage begins with me. Rule number 5, collaboration is impossible without communication. And finally, rule number 6, without humility, there will be no happiness. Without humility, there will be no happiness. Proverbs 11 verse 2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom. You can be right or you can be happy. Something we've all heard. We laugh at it, we joke about it, but the reality is that statement is a pretty accurate statement. You can be right or you can be happy. You can be prideful, you can always focus on being heard, you can always focus on making your point, you can always focus on being right, or you can humble yourself. Even when you disagree, you can listen. Even when you're angry, you can remain calm. Even when you want to fight back, you can hold your tongue. Pride says, I didn't do anything wrong. They're the ones that did something wrong. I'm not apologizing. I don't care how long it takes. I won't be the first one to give in. Humility says, yes, they did something wrong, but so did I. They probably need to apologize to me, but even if they don't, I'll still apologize to them because I care more about the relationship than I do about being right. Pride says, I do this and this and this. I work 80 hours a week. I pay all the bills. Or I stay home. I cook, clean, take care of the kids. And then he comes home and he sits down on the couch. Pride turns marriage into a competition. Pride divides the husband and the wife. Humility brings you together as a team. Humility unites you as husband and wife. Pride looks out for me, myself, and I. Humility puts the needs of my spouse before the needs of myself. Pride says we will never agree. We will never see eye to eye. Humility says I'm determined to find common ground. Pride says this isn't going to work. I deserve better. Humility says I'll do whatever I have to do to make this work. I'm blessed beyond measure. Listen to me. When something goes wrong, pride asks, what's grounds for divorce? Humility asks, what's grounds for forgiveness? Do you really want to live happily ever after? Learn to practice, learn to walk in humility. As the team comes forward as we close, 6 rules for a healthy marriage. If God's not first, my marriage will suffer. My spouse is my first priority on earth. Not every action needs a reaction. A better marriage begins with me. Collaboration without communication is impossible. Without humility, there will be no happiness. Remember, God is your 1, your spouse is your 2. That's not my blueprint, that's His blueprint. That's the blueprint we should all follow. Those are the order that our priorities should be in. As they sing this last song, as always, these altars are going to be open for anything. But here's how I want to close. As they sing this last song, couples, whether you're married, whether you're dating, whether you're engaged, if your significant other is in this room at some point during this last song, I want you to get together and I want you to lead a prayer. I want you to pray that God would bless your relationship. I want you to pray that God will help you humble yourselves and become united as a couple. I want you to pray that God will help you to follow His blueprint and to put Him first in your relationship. I want you to pray that God as a couple will help you to honor and glorify Him in all that you do. So as they sing this last song, at some point, men, I want you to lead your wife, your girlfriend, your fiance in a prayer. Let's stand and sing.